And Brittany, to confirm, you're good.
All right. Well, as everyone begins to trickle in, I just wanted to welcome everyone to this IPR webinar in partnership with Edelman. This webinar is on the trust data from the Edelman Trust Barometer, specifically focused on the APAC Region Report. And we're just so grateful to have the Edelman team, also partners throughout the industry to share insights on some of the specific findings from the different regions. A few housekeeping notes. This is being recorded and it will be available for playback within 48 hours. It'll be on our website and our YouTube channel. We'll also share the link to that within 48 hours via email to all registered attendees, as well as any resources shared throughout the presentation. We're going to start with a presentation of the findings and then transition into a moderated Q&A with our panelists. With that, if you have any tech difficulties, just feel free to message myself. I will help moderate any of those issues. All should be good though. And with that, just let us know if you have any questions, and I will hand it over to Margot to introduce all of the panelists. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think what we'll do first is perhaps go through the report itself, and then I'll hand it over, if it works, to Warren, I think, to introduce folks and ask questions as well. So Brittany, if it works for you, maybe we start with some of the findings and then can go from there.
Sounds great. Margot, can you see my screen?
No, I can. Thank you. Perfect. All right. We're starting with our 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer, and this is the report for the APAC region. So interestingly, we do this as a global study, and of course, then in sort of 28 countries around the world. And this is going to specifically focus on the findings from APAC. Let's go to the next slide. All right. Well, I know I believe the sound didn't work for most folks, but there were a lot of beautiful images on there. So hopefully folks at least got a little bit of a hint of what we're gonna talk about. So specifically, this year's study was really all about trust and innovation. And that's the focus of this year's Trust Barometer. So just for some context on the Trust Barometer, this is the 24th year that we're doing it. And it's specifically a survey that measures trust in 4 key institutions. It's business, government, media, and NGOs. We have measured it in 28 countries, 32,000 respondents around the world, so a little over 1,000 respondents per country. It really gets a representative sample of what we see as trust in these 4 key institutions around the world. So now let's dig into some of the findings from this year. So as we talked about, it's 24 years of trust, which is pretty incredible. Again, you can really see sort of some of the elements of trust really follow what's going on in the world. So for example, in 2021, emerging out of the pandemic, business was the most trusted. Interestingly, back in 2005, we could see that there was a shift from what we're calling sort of top down to peer-to-peer. But we can really see sort of what's going on in the world of trust mirrors what's going on in the world overall. So this year we chose to do a deep dive in innovation. Next slide. So first, let's talk about a shift in authority. What's really interesting and what we found is that actually it's the APAC countries that are leading on trust. So when we look at overall at which countries trust institutions and which ones don't, we found is it's really the APAC countries in the developing world that trust institutions, and it's the developed world, in particular Western Europe and the US, that doesn't. But it's particular, it's China, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. They all say they trust institutions, both for we call the general population, and that was true in 2023, and also in 2020 as well. And another interesting finding is that is actually less of what we call an institutional imbalance compared to global. So what we found overall is that government wasn't seen as competent or ethical in a lot of Western countries. However, in APAC, this is not the case. Government is seen much more as ethical and also as competent. However, business in both places is still seen as both competent and ethical. Another interesting finding here is that in this last 10-year shift, we see less trust for companies headquartered in global powers. So interestingly, we asked, well, do you trust companies headquartered in China? In Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, people said they did, and actually trust in companies headquartered in China actually went up. However, in places like in Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, India, and China, it went down slightly. And there's actually much less trust among European countries and also in America for companies headquartered in China. There's actually the most trust for companies headquartered in Germany, and the US is in the middle. There's also been a dispersion of authority. What we found, interestingly, is that we found peers are on par with scientists and experts in terms of trust. So people do trust scientists. They also trust a company's technical expert, but importantly, they also trust someone like me. So what does that mean for us in the communications world? It means you both need to hear both from sort of the experts, but you also need to be hearing from peers. And then another thing is that there's a trust imbalance. So what we found is that in APAC, business and government are the most trusted to introduce innovation to society, but it needs to be in an inclusive way. What we found is when we look at business, for example, businesses are trusted, especially among high-income people, same with NGOs. But then when you get to low-income, business is less trusted, and then NGOs, government, and media are really not trusted at all. And then again, when we look at this for specifically APAC without China, the numbers are actually pretty interesting because high income is even more trusted, actually, when you remove China. And then if you look at trust in industry subsectors, what we see is that trust in industry subsectors doesn't guarantee trust in industry innovations. So this is particularly true in areas like technology, where artificial intelligence is much less trusted than in technology overall. And this is actually more true for global, than it is in Asia. The same thing is true in healthcare. There's a 21-point gap between healthcare and then gene-based medicine, and then an even bigger gap between F&B, food and beverage, and genetically modified foods. But in particular, technology, I know a lot of us work in the tech sector. The fact that it's only 17 points in Asia is actually a good thing. And gosh, in the rest of the world, it's actually a much bigger number. And what's at stake? It's actually acceptance of innovation. So what we can see here is that when people say that they, in particular, have something like more enthusiasm for green energy, or they're enthusiastic for AI, what we call tipping the balance, what we really see is here when they reject the innovation, they don't accept it into society. And then when they do, they say they embrace it. And what people also think is that government lacks the competence to regulate emerging innovations. So we asked people, do they believe that the government regulators lack adequate understanding of emerging technologies to regulate them effectively? APAC is pretty similar to global, and 61% of people say that government regulators, they agree that they lack adequate understanding of emerging technologies to regulate them effectively. And at least in 1 and 2 across all APAC countries, say the government is actually not regulating it well. People also are concerned that the government has too much influence on science. So we asked, how many of you agree that science has become politicized in this country? What we found globally is that 53% said yes, same in APAC. When we then delved into the different countries, 67% of people in China said they thought the science had become politicized. In Australia, it stands at 59%. Actually, only places like Japan don't think it has. And when we asked, do government and organizations that fund research have too much influence on how science is done? In China, 75% of the people said yes. In India, 70% of the people said yes. Only in Japan, 40% said yes. So big schism there, but especially in places like China and India, people believe that government has too much influence on science. And so what happens when people feel that innovation is poorly managed? They are more likely to fear it. So when we asked, in thinking about innovation, do I trust how business and innovation introduce innovations into society? Can government regulate new technologies? And is science independent of politics and money? What we found is that people were 2 times more likely to say innovation is poorly managed versus well managed, 39 to 22. In APAC, concerns across innovation mismanaged is shared across income, gender, and age. When we ask overall, it's 22% innovation is well managed, 34% innovation is poorly managed. This is true across low, middle, and high income, true for men and women, and true for people of all ages as well. It's pretty evenly spread. And then nearly all countries are more likely to believe that innovation is mismanaged rather than well managed. And all APAC countries are more likely to say innovation is poorly managed, not well managed. So if you look over here on the right, there's a pretty big group that actually says that innovation is poorly managed, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Thailand, whether it's Japan, whether it's China. More people are saying innovation is poorly managed versus well managed. And what happens is when institutions mismanage innovation, there's more rejection and less enthusiasm for the emerging technologies. So when people believe innovation is well managed, they're more likely to accept things like green energy, AI, gene-based medicine, even GMO foods. And the vast majority then start saying they reject the innovation when they believe it's poorly managed. Again, I just want to call out how much more likely to accept innovations like AI that the APAC countries are versus places like the US, where it's actually a much lower acceptance rate. And then when institutions mismanage innovation, fairness and capitalism is in question. So when people believe that innovation is poorly managed, they're more likely to believe the system is biased in favor of the rich. And the same thing for believing that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. And that is particularly true, well, frankly, it's true across the board, but it is very much true in places like China, for example. So how do we restore trust in the promise of innovation?
One second, just. Okay. Okay, if you want to go ahead.
Perfect. Next slide.
Are you able to see that?
I still see the restoring trust in the promise of innovation.
Is this the correct slide? Can you?
It just needs to be that needs to be the next one.
This
Ready?
one? My apologies. I need to.
No problem. Oh, it's the one before. Perfect. All right.
Thank you for your patience.
CEOs are expected to address the impact of innovation in society. So this is both true for global and for APAC. People expect CEOs to manage changes occurring in society, not just those occurring in their business. Employees agree that their CEOs need to speak publicly about things like jobs, skills of the future, ethical use of technology, and automation's impact on jobs. Can't emphasize enough how important all these conversations are, especially with so much about how AI is going to change jobs. People also want to be shown how innovation is going to bring them a better future. So specifically, among those who have high confidence that each innovation will lead to a better future, far more people are likely to embrace innovation. And again, that's true among green energy, AI, gene-based, and even GMO foods. There's much more acceptance among those with high confidence that each innovation will lead to a better future. So in conclusion, how do we restore trust in the promise of innovation? Implementation is important as invention. Mismanaged innovations are likely to divide society, even as it advances society. With breakthroughs in things like AI, vaccines, and green energy, explaining science and managing the impact is essential. Business and government need to partner. Business is most trusted to introduce innovation into society. This is going to be more effectively achieved in partnership with government. CEOs need to demonstrate the broader societal impact that innovation can bring. Science needs to integrate with society. Scientists are still trusted, but increasingly subject to public scrutiny. To build trust in expert recommendations, explain the research, engage in dialogue, and harness peer voices as advocates. And again, I think in APAC, a very interesting finding was that the government had too much influence over science. And then lastly, and I think this is incredibly important, give me control over my future. When people feel in control over how innovations impact their lives, they're more likely to adopt them, not resist them, and listen to concerns, of course, and be open to questions. So any questions from those on the line before we head over to the panel that my colleague Warren will lead?
Let's see, I'm looking at the chat. I Don't see any questions currently. So we can hand it over to Warren, I think.
Perfect.
Margot, I think we have Lynn as our host and moderator, so perhaps I should defer to her to...
Apologies. All right.
Thank you, and thanks to IPR for having this event in an Asia-Pacific friendly time zone. We really appreciate it, and I can't believe that it's 24 years of the Edelman Trust Barometer, the same amount of time I've been in Hong Kong, and it's wonderful to hear these thoughts and very important issues, especially as we all emerge here in Hong Kong and Asia. We're suffering from a little bit of PTSD post-pandemic, so these issues are really important to address. Staying with Asia Pacific, I'm going to start with Warren for a question. What was really incredible to me in these findings is that the major APAC markets enjoy higher trust levels than the Western counterparts. Can you explain, what role does innovation and economic progress contribute to these higher trust levels? And, what are the factors that contribute? I know that you're a former journalist and editor. Is it that the British who are at the bottom of the list, are they more skeptical because of the free press that perhaps some Asia Pacific countries do not have? What are those factors? Can you comment on that and give us some insight?
Sure, thanks, Lynn. There's several things going on here, so let me try and tease the trends apart. You're right to say that Asia generally has higher levels of trust in its key institutions, and this has been a consistent finding across many, many years. So China, India, Indonesia, Singapore, and it's not difficult to see why. Long before I became a member of the Edelman team, I used to write about the trust barometer findings, and I once put this question to the former Prime Minister of Singapore, and I said, why does Singapore score so highly on the trust index? And his reply was actually quite interesting and instructive, as he said, why are you surprised? Look at where we have been, third world, and where we are today, first world. And at Edelman, we often say action breeds trust. And the action, development, the progress that you see in these societies has engendered trust in governments, in institutions. And you see that playing out all across Asia, right? So trust not only in institutions, but in this latest report, trust in innovation and technology. Because right across the region, the story of the last few decades, 50 years or so, has been how innovation and technology has lifted societies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, from third world to first. And people know that innovation and technologies, the acceptance of it, does lead to improvements in their lives. And therefore, you see, as Margot presented, high levels of trust in innovation, whether it's green technology or AI, willingness to accept it. Now, that's the underlying trend. But even in Asia, you see elements of doubt emerging. People starting to wonder, are these new technologies being well managed, being well regulated? Are they being regulated in the interest of the broad sweep of society for someone like me? Or is there some hidden profit motive or government agenda? Is science becoming politicized? The chart that Margot showed of doubts about whether innovation is being well managed, it's sort of sliding trend downwards. Most of the Asian countries sort of clustered around the extreme right. So it does show that there are doubts, but it's at a lower level than the rest of the world. And when we interpret these findings, what we take away is that yes, there are concerns about how innovation is playing out, but it's not to the same extent and depth that you see in the democracies in the West. And that gives Asia a little bit of an innovation advantage, because if these innovations are well managed and well explained and well rolled out, the willingness to give them a try, whether it's green technologies or AI, is there. But if you don't manage them well, then that advantage can quickly be dissipated, and the same doubts and concerns will emerge. And as Margot rightly pointed out, those concerns in parts of Asia could become even deeper and more entrenched. So the innovation advantage is a small and fleeting one, which I think societies ought to seize and make use of. Now, you ask about the media. So as a former journalist, let me try and give that an answer as well. I think there is some element about freedom of the press and control and abilities to debate these issues. And inherently, democracies tend to be skeptical about governments and institutions. So I think there's some element of that. But even here, it's a mixed bag, right? So in China, in Saudi Arabia, high levels of control, to some extent here in Singapore as well, constraints on the media. But in India and Indonesia, you have the most rambunctious press going on, right? And it doesn't affect the ability to have high levels of trust. So I think the key thing here is not just mainstream media, it's the drift towards social media, it's the drift towards search, and people wanting to have access to their own information and interpret for themselves. And even in places like China, high levels of sense that science is being too politicized, too much government control, despite all the media control. So I don't think it's just a pure fact about the control of the media that's shaping it. And many, many factors at play in this very complex picture.
Thank you, Warren. And you've got good insights as a CEO of Asia Pacific for Edelman and also former media. So thank you for sharing both sides for us. Let's go to Andrew, who's Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs for Janssen Asia Pacific. Can you tell us what role effective communication plays in fostering trust between healthcare and consumers, particularly at a time when 60% of the APAC respondents say that government has too much control on how science is done? Yet 76% of APAC respondents say they trust scientists for the truth about innovations. So, for health communications, people trust people. How do we personalize our communications in this healthcare landscape, move away from faceless companies and engage with the audiences that we reach? There are a few different questions in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think largely the answer is in the statistics, right? As you said, seeing the higher level of trust for scientists versus governments is not surprising, because scientists, while it is a collective term in the survey, is talking about people. Governments is an entity. And so you see that people trust people, not institutions. And so how, as communicators in the healthcare space, we can continue to build upon that is really, really important. So I'm actually doing some training at the minute with our team here, talking about executive thought leadership and really thinking about who is it that we put forward as the spokesperson for our companies? Who is the face of our engagement? I think in the past, a lot of companies have spoken as a company or on behalf of the company, whereas increasingly to have trust, it's having leaders, it's having executives, it's having comms people, having a more personal touch to the communications that organizations are putting out, to be a face to the name, and picking and really understanding the right face to help explain the innovations too is important. So that's where scientists obviously become important. You don't want necessarily a PR person explaining the science. You want an actual scientist that works on it, talking about the impact that they're wanting to do in the research, or the impact that they feel that their research is making in people's lives, to make it understandable. And I think for us as communicators, where then the challenge and the opportunity arises is oftentimes our scientist colleagues can be not as au fait with the media. So how do we equip them to communicate in a simple to understand and easily accessible way, particularly, and we'll get into this more as we unpack some of the innovations. Innovation is getting more complex and harder to understand from the outside. So how can they make that explainable? And if we look at like the subcategories of research from the Trust Barometer, I think in the healthcare side, looking at gene therapies in particular, like just the word can sound a bit scary. So how do you really make that simple, understandable to build trust? And how do you equip the scientists in your organization or the researchers in your organization to be the face of that?
So true. And, sometimes I think scientists might want to share a little bit more than they're really allowed at that time until things have been proven. Let's go to Lauren. So Lauren is Senior Director of Communications Asia for Microsoft. You're really a company at the forefront of innovation. Can you talk us through what your initial reactions were to the key findings in the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer, particularly regarding trust in technology in the APAC region?
Thanks, Lynn. So I guess full disclosure up front, I'm an Edelman alumni, and so I'm very familiar with the Trust Barometer. It's been a few years since I sort of sat across the data in detail, but I do know the work rather well. So I think the first observation, I think others have picked up on this, is that the trust data by market more or less tracks the economic growth trajectory story. right? I think you see economies like India, China, Malaysia, Thailand, all growing at a significantly faster clip than, say, the OECD average, for example, at somewhere between kind of 5 and 8%. I think I read somewhere something like 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty in India over the last 20 years. You can start to see some of this data in the context, I think, of the macroeconomic picture. Second, and I think this bears saying, and I think everyone on the call knows this, that I would really caution any attempt to paint APAC with a broad brush, right? I think as ever, there are huge variations between the kind of high trust set. We talked about India, Indonesia, I think I saw Thailand in there. And then your lower trust set, which includes markets as varied as like Korea, Japan, Australia. So sometimes I think the mean can really mask the nuance. I think for us, and I'll maybe spend a little bit more time on the innovation as it relates to AI kind of subset. I think it's really obvious to us that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. I think Andrew was getting at that with the way they're thinking about spokespeople and what is sort of public facing. I think what we see in Asia Pacific is a whole gamut of concerns when it comes to emerging technologies, running from like aversion to outright rejection all the way to kind of elation, right? That spectrum is really broad. And I think underlying a lot of it, and this probably speaks not only to AI, but gene therapy and GMO and so on, that just the technology as a whole is seen to be progressing too quickly. And maybe people are feeling a bit left behind. So I think there's a recognition that there's definitely a tech or innovation advantage in this region. I think you'll kind of see that in what Microsoft has been doing over the last months. I don't think it's a massive surprise. Margot had a slide up about the delta between technology as a whole being trusted, with a big gap between that and where AI is. I think our own research more or less tracks this. I think we see APAC as a whole, 1 and 2 are highly trusting. And frankly, when you overlay that with adoption rates, it tracks completely. Adoption breeds trust, and aversion has the opposite effect. And I think when you kind of stack rank emerging technologies, we see AI behind technologies like 5G, robotics, IoT, but then somewhere ahead of the pack when you compare it to social media, self-driving cars, blockchain, and other emerging technologies. I think Margot had some slides showing demographics and gender. I think we see when you look at AI as a kind of subset, the informed public and Gen Z having higher trust levels than the public at large, and really pronounced high adoption rates in places like Indonesia, India, Taiwan. Again, if you take APAC as a whole, Australia is very often an outlier, which probably won't surprise many of us. I think there was one slide that Margot had that looked at acceptance versus rejection of AI. I don't see that as a surprise at all. I think what we see coming through around optimism is about the potential AI has to impact society as a whole. But very often that's in tension or kind of offset by really tangible, immediate concerns around misinformation, information hygiene and reliability and things like that. And then I think when you kind of zoom out, really significant people are significant numbers of people I think are fearful that AI may represent a kind of future existential risk. And then I think it would be worth spending a bit of time, to the extent we're going to talk about AI, the AI expectations, the needs that people have vary significantly by market. I think we see places like India, Indonesia as AI playing a role as a gateway to bettering education. In places like Korea, it's expected to boost productivity, improve the overall economic growth. And then you move over to Japan, and there's expectations that it's going to address the demographic crisis of an aging population. Last thing I'd say is I'm really interested in the data around public trust when it comes to scientific research and this perception that there's too much political meddling. I'm really interested in what the other panelists' views are. I think there's probably a whole webinar, Lynn, we could spend talking about the COVID postmortem in China and the kind of hangover of distrust that's still very, very pervasive there.
Yeah, you're right. I think that speaks
Lauren-
to the experience that people had, especially in China during the pandemic. And Andrew, would you like to comment on that, or Warren, before we go on to the next question?
I think it's an interesting thing, and writ large, when you look at the healthcare industry, and particularly the pharmaceutical industry, the trust and engagement with the industry went through a seismic changes through COVID. We talk about the fact that healthcare is something people don't want to think about unless they're sick. When you're well, you generally don't want to think about healthcare. And so suddenly when the world is unwell with COVID and you have an industry that can help provide a solution, trust and engagement shot up through the roof. But then I think, as you saw coming out of the pandemic, once people started to feel more on top of the situation and feel more on top of their health, that trust and things declined very quickly. And there's a lot that could be looked at there around the actions of governments, the actions of companies, the actions of private entities, the actions of even some of sort of the global governing bodies. All of those then contributed to shifts in people's level of trust around healthcare as a concept in general. So I do think it's something you could unpack over a much longer period of time. It's a much bigger topic, I think, and would be happy to talk about that more at length with anyone as well, because I've got many thoughts on the perspective of healthcare post-COVID and what that means for trust.
Lynn, if I could jump in at this point, I think Lauren points to a very important finding about China, because even though China is still, the highest in terms of overall trust, it did see a 4 percentage point decline this year. And I think the zero COVID experience, a very traumatic experience for many of our colleagues and their families and friends in China, is having a significant and long-lasting impact. And you see that coming through in the doubts about whether government has too much influence over science and whether science is being too politicized. And these findings are coming up even in China. So I do think it has an impact, and it has also led to people questioning to what extent government should be playing this role and to what extent government is competent to be playing this role, because these technologies are progressing so fast and so relentlessly. Can governments keep up? And that's where I think business can play a role by stepping up and partnering with government and helping to lend credibility to the whole new technologies and how they're implemented in our society.
Yeah, I think the interesting, maybe we'll unpack this in one of the later questions too, that you see on the trust piece is, and Lauren, you were talking about the people being elevated out of poverty in India in the large numbers, but I think the divide between the have and the have-nots will only accelerate, unfortunately, as innovation accelerates. Particularly we're seeing that in healthcare, and I think that's the responsibility then of companies to partner with governments to look at how to reverse that trend and how to make sure that the cutting-edge innovations that are being developed in the healthcare space are able to be accessible to much broader chunks of the population. And I think because they're not, that's where you start to see the disconnect on trust as well.
So yeah, that actually leads on to a question that I have. Perhaps Warren and Andrew, you might want to chip in on this, is how can businesses navigate that political discourse, engage responsibly without alienating their stakeholders or exacerbating those societal divisions that exist? There is an opportunity with government being more trusted in this part of the world. So is there an opportunity to partner with government, lead them on, let them lead on innovation, and support them with that to be seen to be acting for the good of society? Warren, would you like to comment, please?
Sure. I think Margot showed the slides earlier, which showed a big increase in desire for business to work with government. Both business and government were seen as trusted to implement these new technologies, but there was an increasing desire for them to work together and to do it in an inclusive way. So people do want to see business leaders working with governments and doing so in a way that helps explain to them how these new technologies are going to make an impact on their lives and benefit someone like themselves, benefit people in their society. So I think there is a role for business leaders to do so, and to do so by connecting to issues that people care about. How are these technologies going to impact my jobs, my future? How is it going to improve my life? And it's not just driven by a short-term political or profit motive. So I think business leaders can connect, and generally people do trust their own CEO. So there's an opportunity for CEOs to step up and engage on these issues, and then help explain how these technologies might improve and benefit people. So I think there's a big role for business to play here. Andrew.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think education is so key. I think we can underestimate that often as communicators, and particularly communicators that are in an industry vertical, and they're sort of enmeshed in the knowledge. Like, you kind of forget that, you know, when you're talking with governments, the government stakeholders are often dealing with thousands of different innovations across a single industry category, and then you times that exponentially as they look at multiple industry categories as well. And so the role that we have to clearly, simply articulate some of these technologies should not be underestimated. I think oftentimes we fail to sort of understand the importance of that, or underappreciate the importance of that. And then I think the other element, and I think to Warren's point of explaining like the benefits is important, but also explaining sort of how it works. I think some of the technologies still have a bit of a mystery box feel. Like, we're going to probably unpack AI a bit more. And I think helping people understand that it's not magic, that the ChatGPT platform, the transformer models, for example, it's science-based, it's algorithmic, there's rules to the process. It's not like the black magic box that the answers pop out. The same as when you look at gene therapies, it's not some mystical thing that suddenly changes your body's structure. It's a very controlled scientific approach with rigorous research behind it. And explaining some of the background can also help with the trust, because when you just tell them, hey, this is going to be good for you, if they don't understand why or how it works, then you can have trust issues as well.
Then if I could add one more example of how, you know, people want to see how it's benefiting their lives, and refer to the finding that Margot pointed out about how trust in companies that are based in China has gone up across Southeast Asia. Everywhere else trust is coming down, but in Southeast Asia, trust in Chinese companies tend to increase by 14 percentage points, a significant increase. And it's not difficult to see why, because if you look at the high-speed rail that's just been launched in Indonesia from Jakarta to Bandung, people are seeing Chinese technologies being rolled out, helping to reduce their commuting times, improving the horrific traffic conditions that they've had to endure for the longest time. They see electric vehicles, Chinese companies, you know, being sold at affordable rates and improving their lives. These are real-life things that are playing out in their lives, and they're seeing these technologies, these innovations, making an improvement in their lives. So I do think when people see the benefits of these technologies for themselves and their families, the acceptance and the willingness to say, yeah, this I will sign up for is important. So the implementation, the rollout is critical if you're going to get acceptance of these new innovations.
This is a very important point. It goes back to the economic progress, inspiring trust as well. Let me bring Lauren back here, because I think we're mostly communicators on this call and in the audience, and I think we could benefit from some practical tips and advice from you, Lauren, on how is actually Microsoft, as the AI industry leader, how are you driving trust and adoption amongst customers, society at large? I'll ask a little bit later about what you're doing in the workplace for your employees, but at the moment, how are you driving that trust and adoption amongst your customers and in society?
Yeah, just to close off on the previous point, Warren, I saw a very interesting slide recently on where there's Belt and Road investment money going across Asia and where trust is trending upward. I'll have to share it with you. So I think just kind of taking a step back, I think it's helpful to kind of just remind ourselves, like, we're in year 2 of the AI age, and I think like the reminder is important, right? Because I think we sometimes get ahead of ourselves. And I know that both the other panelists have talked about kind of meeting audiences where they are, recognizing where most audiences are. Is like, if the technology sector is in year 2, I would say probably most people are in year 0 or maybe in year 1. And I think the scaling laws behind this are surprising, you know, those of us who are even very close to it. And look, I think the original premise behind folks who were dreaming up computers and inventing them was that one day they would understand us rather than us understanding them, and we're kind of there or very close to getting there. And this idea that there's now natural language interface and there's no barrier to entry, something I think we're all still kind of grappling with. But I think the theme that we keep coming back to in this conversation is, trust has to be earned on the basis of people feeling real tangible benefit. I think I am a big believer in the technology is only useful if it's going to drive, economic gains and productivity and output and all that for the masses. I think to the extent that economic forecasts are useful, and we could probably debate that for another hour, it's sometimes useful and instructive to kind of see what economists are saying about this. And I think if you just take Southeast Asia as a subset, the expectation is that AI is going to contribute another $1 trillion to GDP by the end of the 2020s. So you think about an extra 15 to 20 points of incremental GDP across the region, and really cross-sectoral growth in healthcare, energy, retail, education, you name it. I think that's when people might kind of sit up and go, oh, okay. And I think the other thing I'd say is, unlike probably most of the technological waves we might have lived through or took place in the 20th century that had really highly uneven availability, distribution, adoption, this is technology in the main getting developed in the US for now, but getting into people's hands faster and probably more evenly than anything we would have seen, certainly in our lifetimes. And even some emerging evidence that the technology has the potential to kind of reduce inequalities rather than widen them as other technologies may have done. So I think for a company like us, it's exciting to be at the nexus of this, and really, as a platform company, being able to have developers and companies build on top of what we have to offer. And I think it's why you're seeing us invest in really foundational digital architecture through big investments. You've probably seen data center announcements across Asia over the last 6 months. Again, that alignment with where governments are headed and where their digital agendas are is super, super important. And really making sure that the human capital piece is incorporated, right? It's not just data centers and big infrastructure and the rest is kind of an afterthought. I think there's a recognition across the tech sector that there's huge talent shortages in Asia, really, really acute in areas like cybersecurity. So I think you'll continue to see announcements like the one we made in Indonesia a couple of weeks ago, skilling several million people over the next couple of years for jobs that don't yet exist, so that they can take advantage of how the economy is going to be shape-shifting over the next few years. And I think just trying to ground it very practically in what we do as communicators, I think we're thinking about it in kind of 3 very practical ways. I think there's some echoes in what Andrew and Warren were saying. I think there's a real sense of needing to demystify, right? This sort of like black box wizardry, like none of that. Really trying to tap into the fears, understand them, and help unpack them and like myth bust a little bit there. We know there's public concerns around the misinformation ecosystem and so on. I hate the word transparency. I much prefer a word like open because it's more honest. But I think that's a principle. I think there's a sense of really taking advantage of voices. I know Andrew was talking about this before, really humanizing what is happening and having our customers speak on our behalf. And then the third is really just around making it super practical, relatable, tangible, here and now. Again, that sort of black box wizardry piece, just sort of massively putting that perception to bed. I think that's ultimately what's going to build trust and earn, credibility in this era.
Mm-hmm. And can you expand, Lauren, on how this is being deployed in your workplace and with employees? I mean, I got a bit of a shock when you said we're in year 2. What? Because coming from the luxury hospitality industry, I'd say we're very much in year 0. We're still perhaps some back of house areas, but this is really incredible to me. So we're looking at other industries to see how they're adopting it and how we can learn and perhaps benefit our guests. But I'd be very interested in how Microsoft is adopting this and deploying it.
Yeah. So I suppose in some ways, Lynn, like we're customer zero for our own Kool-Aid, right? Like the technology has existed for nearly 2 years, and we weren't using it. We couldn't very well expect anyone else to be. But if it makes you feel any better, I would say like 2024 is the year of AI at work. I think 2023 was very much the year of the arrival of innovations and the kind of woo, ah, wow. I can do this and that. I think there's probably some interesting nuggets in the data that we just put out last week, I think it was, with LinkedIn. Really interesting. I'd be very interested to know the attendees today, how this shakes out for them. But more than 8 in 10 knowledge workers across the Asia Pacific region are now using AI at work. They would say they're doing it to keep up with the pace and their volume of work. They'd say that AI is helping them save time in their day, deal with just overall volume, and in many cases boosting creativity and helping them focus on their most important work. Here's the rub. I think the majority of leaders would say their companies need to adopt AI to stay competitive, but most are worried that their company or their kind of leadership bench don't actually have a plan and vision to implement it. So where does that leave people? I think there are many cases, and our data would say as many as 8 in 10 are bringing their own tools to work. So what we would call BYO AI. Unsanctioned tools, of course, are running the risk of putting, company data at risk. And then fundamentally, organizations are missing out on the chance to benefit from strategically deployed AI, right? If you've got a whole mix of things under the hood that you can't reconcile with and that weren't scaled and purchased at kind of core, there's massive data risk there. So I think there's a lot to kind of unpack there. I think the trend in Asia that you'll see coming through in our data is the skills piece is super, super important. I think majority of leaders are saying that there isn't the right talent to fill the roles that they'll have this year. We talked about cybersecurity. Engineering is another area. Creative design is another one, which might surprise people. And overwhelmingly, 3/4 of leaders would say they would hire a less experienced candidate with AI skills over somebody who had 0 AI skills.
Fascinating. So there's an opportunity there for more education. Can I go back to Andrew? So I'm staying on communications. What communication strategies can healthcare organizations employ to establish and sustain trust with both patients and the wider public? You mentioned already that this fear around gene therapy, for example, how do you communicate what is increasingly very complex science and make it more understandable for the people that you're communicating with?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking as we were going through the discussion, sort of touched on some of these points already, but it's like, a lot of people, they fly. They understand the benefits of going on a plane, you get you great places, but they're often still scared of going on the plane. And one of the key sort of behavioral techniques for getting over fear of flying is they put you in like a program and they teach you how the wings work and airspeed flow and lift and how actually it's really hard for a plane to actually crash. And they're designed very safely. And so in the same way, how do we look at communicating around some of these technologies, as Lauren said, to demystify? And I think particularly in the healthcare space, it's one thing to be scared about something that's away from your body, but then to be scared about something that's happening inside your body is incredibly challenging. Going back as well to the COVID piece, we saw the misinformation around healthcare explode like wildfire throughout COVID, and what people were saying about the vaccines and a lot of the conversation around that topic became very, very challenging. And so I think there's a real impetus now to focus on combating misinformation, having trusted sources of information talking about healthcare, and then having those established trusted sources explain things in a way that help people really understand what it's doing, what it's achieving, and why it's important to get behind. So if we use an example, so I won't get into gene therapy, but I'll make a slightly different track of cell therapy. That's potentially easier to explain somewhat. So in cell therapy, essentially at its essence is training your immune system to target a tumor or a disease or condition. So it's repriming your immune system. And the current sort of standard for doing this is they'll extract your T cells. So I think most people know what a T cell is. It's a part of your body that's part of your immune defense system. It goes and it attacks foreign bodies that sort of enter into your system. So it's taking those T cells and training them to go and kill the cancer cells and then re-injecting them back into your body. And so even just a simple explanation of that, I know it can sound scary to some people, like taking some of your body out, changing it in a lab, and then putting it back in. So how do you sort of walk people through that process? And then when they can understand the benefit as well as the process, then hopefully the trust will go up. And then, as I said, I think the final piece from a communications angle is really looking at about how we partner with governments and other players in the environment around the access question, particularly in Asia Pacific, because a lot of these innovations are complex and costly. And I think it's almost in some ways the inverse to what Lauren was saying with AI, where you've seen this proliferation because it is very easy. You can run the apps on your phone and have access to these incredible tools. Whereas the innovations that we're seeing in the healthcare space are becoming more complex, requiring more engagement from healthcare professionals to make sure they're successful. So if we look at the CAR T example again, one of the side effects that you can have from a CAR T therapy is a cytokine storm. Sounds scary even in the name, but essentially it's your body then reacting to these re-engineered cells and essentially attacking itself. And you need doctors to supervise that. So it's not that you can take this treatment and suddenly give it out to the masses. It needs to have understanding of the clinicians and have careful management. And so how do companies and communicators work to explain some of this, to partner and to look at how we tackle these access barriers to make sure that everybody can benefit from these technologies as they come, and they're not just excluded and focused on high-income countries or high-income portions of countries that can get access. So I think that's the big challenge facing us going forward as a whole healthcare industry.
I think,
yeah, Warren, can you chip in here?
I think both Lauren and Andrew put it very well. It's that communication in a very human way that someone like me can understand, and I think that's the most important factor that's coming across. Because people, they know these technologies are complex, but they want to hear someone engage them at the human level in terms they can understand. And even the findings show that scientists are not doing enough to explain to folks. It's often above them. It's just speaking above my head to other scientists, to other researchers. And the more we can help as communicators, help scientists, help business leaders to communicate and to engage the audience, because the audience, from the findings, does want to be engaged. They want to have explanations of why this technology is going to make a significant difference to their lives. And I think that's the critical role that we can play as communicators, because it will help all our societies, all our companies accept these technologies. And I think that the findings really speak to that point.
They do. Just looking at the time here, Brittany, can I check if there are any questions from the audience that I can't see?
I don't see any in the Q&A box or the chat, so we are good on that front.
Okay, so maybe just a question to wrap up, and this goes to all of our panelists. So we've talked a lot about that collaboration is necessary across the sectors and institutions. What kind of collaborative efforts would you say are needed to give people this feeling of being more in control of how innovation affects their lives? Warren, would you like to start?
Well, I think we work with our partners like J&J and others in the healthcare industry to educate patients, to give them a sense of agency, so that they feel part of the process and they accept the benefits. So that's an ongoing effort, and we work with many sectors, whether it's health, tech, and others. So as communicators, we try to bring the message to the audience at the level that they can engage it and understand. I think that's the most important role that we play as a communications advisory firm.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think the other one to look at is who are trusted sources of information and how we can empower those that have the right information to share that information. And I think in healthcare, there's been a bit of an asymmetry there where there's a lot of rules and regulation for very good reason around how you can talk about innovation in healthcare. But what that often means is that those that are working on the innovation, that really understand it, can't talk about it till much later on in the process. And as a result, that information void is often filled by those that don't actually have the information or have a poor understanding of the information. And so I think one of the potential areas that we need to look at with industry, with government, with agency partners, with academia, is how we can make sure that those that actually understand these innovations and technologies have the scope and the ability to share that information responsibly and in a trusted personal manner. And I think there's still work to be done in that regulation space.
Thank you. And Lauren, would you like to comment?
I would say like one other dimension to this for me, Lynn, is thinking about the regulatory landscape. I think there's, particularly in tech, I think there was a reckoning with some mismanagement, to put it mildly, over the social media era. And I think like they're still grappling with it, right? I think if you look around the world, there's still a sort of whack-a-mole approach in the main, and a sense of, we got to this too late. You know, we didn't have proper partnership across the board. It didn't take a whole of society approach. I would say, without, you know, congratulating anyone prematurely, I think there's a sense that dialogue started early and earnest across the board in this AI era, and you see it across governments in the US, Pan-Asia, call it like maybe a couple of like first movers there, but equally in the European Union and in the UK, who hosted the AI Safety Summit a number of months ago. And I do think there is a bit of humility there in saying, you know, nobody has all the answers, but there's a sense that there was some collective reckoning with maybe the last decade worth of what happened in social media, an honest conversation about what we wanted to do, maybe right this time, bring the right trusted voices, as Andrew said, around the table, and really making sure it was an open conversation. And I would say the public dimension of that has been incredibly open. With very rare exception, it has been, you know, transparency, or at the very least openness, across just about every economy that's grappling with this. So I think that's a really, really important point, and one that definitely folks in this group have some influence over.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. I think my key takeaway from this is that we have a lot of work to do. As communications executives, I think we're not going to be replaced by AI anytime soon. Just listening to all the panelists, there's an awful lot of work still to be done. So I think we're safe in terms of that fear. And I would just like to thank Edelman and all our panelists today for joining us, and for the audience for dialing in, and for Margot for taking a time in her evening in the US to give that presentation. I'll just hand over to Brittany for some closing remarks and wrapping up.
Yes, thank you all, like your panelists, Margot, everyone, for taking the time and sharing your insights with us. And thank you all for tuning in. This recording will be available on our website and YouTube channel within 48 hours. We'll email that to you all, along with any resources, including the reports that were referenced today. And be sure to check us out with our next webinar next month in June. But have a great day or evening or wherever you are. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brittany. Thanks, IPR team.